Everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Matchday 4 team selection video. We're going to capture a little bit of the wildcard strategy aspects of the game as we now head in towards the knockout stage of the tournament. I'll also quickly recap how I did in Matchday 3. I'm currently ranked 274 in the world. Not performing as well as I would have liked because I think, to be honest, I've put a couple skill issues into my team. Barcola is a good example of that. Maybe going Xavier in Matchday 2 was an example of that as well. Minutes are king, as ever in any fantasy game, and I've gone with a little bit too much vibes in this tournament so far. So whilst I'm happy with the placing and I still have Fran to go, I still am pending this Real Madrid game. I'm recording this video after Man City have faced off versus Juventus, and I have to say my expectations of Man City have almost shot up through the roof because this is finally the first piece of opposition that they've had that I think is at a generally good level, and I've been super impressed by them, and also just the quality of depth that they have. It also makes it conversely quite tough to pick some of their players outside of Haaland or even Ait-Nouri, for example, where I think those are two players that I feel like would most likely have really strong minutes going forwards, who are also really worth it from a sort of fantasy point of view. So I mean, there's also the likes of Ederson, where if Man City get an easier matchup, which is possible, we'll look into the bracket in a moment, you know, the better a pick like Ederson looks like. And then the midfield, I think Foden's probably still the most spiciest punt. His ownership is a little bit higher now than previously. And then just to top things off when it comes to someone like Foden, there's just so much depth, as you can see with the City team. He's not actually played many minutes within the group stages. And that could actually continue, you know, to be the case, because even if he performs well, even if he's first choice, you could still see very early substitutes coming in for this team like Man City. So that's a small concern. As I said, I'm recording this game before Real Madrid play versus Salzburg, and also equally Al Hilal playing versus Pachuca. And as you can see, there's an extremely high chance that Real Madrid make it towards around the 16. It's a 95% chance effectively, and their chances to come out at the top of the group is effectively 90%. So the bracket should stay exactly as we expect. It's probably in that sort of Al Hilal position where things can change because of an upset with their match versus Pachuca. What I'd like to highlight with this sort of graphic here is it's quite important to actually not just look at, you know, a team's chances to make it towards the finals, but actually kind of look at each stage and see how things change. So when it comes to, let's say, the quarterfinals, I think what's interesting here is we actually have a new chip, and the chip is this new chip called the qualification booster chip. So what it does is that if you activate it in a specific stage in the knockouts, players in your team who qualify for the next round will receive a +2 bonus. So what does that tell you? That probably means that you should actually use it in the quarterfinals, because once again, in the quarterfinals, in my opinion at least, we have the most one-sided matchups. So you're most likely going to be able to pick a much stronger team that will have a lot of players that qualify towards the next round. If you see, for example, here, we have a lot of confidence in certain teams, specifically in their quarterfinals matchup. This is not to say that the teams here with slightly less sort of qualification percentages are bad. For example, Real Madrid's percentages can easily go up as soon as they complete their game in Matchday 3. Equally, what I would mention too is if you look at a team like Chelsea, their quarterfinal game is a little bit tougher because it's Benfica, but actually their semi-final qualification percentage is very, very high, because the idea is they get to face off versus the winner of Palmeiras versus Botafogo, which on paper, you know, the winner of Chelsea versus Benfica should quite easily be able to beat on paper, right? So things can change. Obviously, we know that these Brazilian teams are quite strong, but that's still the average expectation that some of these European teams will most likely go through and find them to be slightly easier as opposition compared to other European teams. But as I said, we've been very impressed by the Brazilian teams. I think models have already started to adjust to that, so I wouldn't be too worried about that sort of lag. And I do think that's fair, right? When you think about some of the brackets, and I think just quickly, you know, looking at the bracket in a moment, but if we just quickly look at the semi-final odds and see how that moves, generally speaking, I think what this means is if you want to use the qualification boost, I think I would still target most of my players to be coming from Inter Milan, PSG, Man City, and then a mix of Bayern and Dortmund. A little bit of Chelsea I think is nice because, as I said, of that semi-final aspect, even Real Madrid would make a lot of sense. To invest in some of the other teams, I probably wouldn't do that, but I'm sure there's still some spicy differentials. What do I mean by that? There's still a lot of sub 5% owned players from teams like Palmeiras, teams like Juventus, teams like Botafogo as well. And they will be differentials that can provide a lot of value for even Monterrey to an extent. So what happens if we change it towards the semifinal? So you can see that the guard has changed, right? Chelsea suddenly shoots up this list, which also means that I think if you want to create a well-rounded draft, part of the strategy aspect is you want to be looking at teams that make it at least towards the semifinals, because you're going to have enough finals or transfers within the finals to make it worthwhile. So I would really only just target teams that actually will make it towards the semifinals, because you've got plenty of transfers as we go, and you've got even more transfers per round, and you'll need even less players, especially in the finals where you're only just going to need 11 players. So as you can see, Chelsea shoots up in the expectations here. Inter Milan actually drops. So does Dortmund, though, which means, you know, maybe we don't need to be overstacking on Dortmund, but it also comes down to how comfortable you are in picking stronger teams, specifically for matchday 4, that might be a little bit weaker long term. So that's the strategy aspect that I think is quite important. So at the time of recording, what is the current expected bracket? What I will say is that there actually looks to be one easy side of the bracket. So the left side of the bracket looks like it is a lot easier. Outside of Man City, I would say that the general quality of teams within this side of the bracket are much, much weaker compared to the right. We have 3 tournament favorites, I would say, with Real Madrid, Bayern, and PSG on one side of the bracket, and PSG expected to face off versus Bayern in the quarterfinals. And that makes it much tougher for teams to really advance, right? So PSG and Bayern is going to be a tough matchup. That probably reduces the quality of the expected points of players from both teams. At the same time, though, these are some of the strongest teams, so there needs to be a bit of a balance in terms of how you approach this from a strategy perspective. What this probably tells me is I'd probably consider investing actually in a little bit of Chelsea, because it seems like they actually have a relatively safe and easy path towards the semifinals if you can kind of take them on with the chance of beating Benfica, which they're favored to do, but not so favored compared to other teams. On top of Man City, we actually looked at some of the sort of Opta predicted odds when it comes to, you know, their chances to move. But I actually think that the odds will continue to move in Man City's favor. I think that the markets will actually react quite heavily towards that absolute thumping of Juventus, and AI models will as well. That's my general intuition. And I think they will react because simply when you look at underlying stats and metrics as well, City have been very impressive. This is the first time, as I said, they faced off versus a good team. So the stronger the sort of reaction to that will come out of, let's say, a model or an AI. So I really do like picking quite a few City players for that aspect. And I think part of the strategy piece here is, in theory, you could still pick a lot of players from Real Madrid and PSG, right? Because if they just meet each other in the semifinal, you don't really need to get rid of them up until the final. And so you can live with that. I think investing into different pockets of the bracket is quite helpful as well, just to have a little bit of diversification. Not over investing within one specific quadrant of the bracket makes sense. So for example, if I was looking at, let's say, PSG and Bayern, I probably wouldn't over invest into that game, especially if I think that the quarterfinal game will be quite tough. I'd probably just pick a team and hope for the best. In this case, I would pick PSG. When I look at the Chelsea team, that's the team that I probably invest into quite heavily, because I'm not likely to dip into the Palmeiras or Botafogo players, and equally even Benfica players. And in the Inter Milan and City piece, because the Inter game looks so good on paper, especially for the defensive point of view, I quite like them versus Fluminense. But City, I think, are so strong that I'd be happy to invest into both. In the Real Madrid bracket, I'm not sure if I love it, because I think Real Madrid's probably the strongest team there, but they actually have, in theory, the toughest matchups. Because Juve is going to give them a decent go for the money. They're probably going to be quite a strong attacking threat, which reduces the quality of the defensive players for Real Madrid, even though you have some options like Fran Garcia, who are sub 5% owned. And then when it comes to a team like, let's say, Bilbao Bay, they have a really good game versus Monterrey, but then the quarterfinal game is tougher. I'd probably still invest into them, though, just because Monterrey, outside of when they played Urawa, have been pretty flat when it comes to offense. But maybe things have changed, right? Benching Canales could have had a dramatic impact on the team, even though he was on paper the talisman, but they played really well without him. So we'll see. But that's kind of my initial thoughts on the tournament. And I think looking at the bracket is helpful just to make sure that you're not over-invested, as I said. So within the context of my own team, just quickly recapping very quickly match day 3, I actually ended up getting 70 points with Fran Garcia to go. I have decided to stick the captaincy on Haaland, so I did move off of Kvaratskhelia, so that's a net loss of 2 points. I was never considering Hakimi captain over him, even though it was close, but I'm not someone who looks really with much of hindsight. Hopefully Fran Garcia as well. I'm in a pretty okay position in the world. I took some hits for some midfield players who just didn't work out at all. Mayulu played, but didn't actually do much. Arias, I've kept in the team, so that was fine. I felt like he wasn't so interesting because he went above 5% ownership. Canales didn't play at all, which was a huge shock, and that was such a one-sided game. I feel like that was a really, really tough one to take. And then, you know, Boca Juniors, the less said the better, because that was some diabolical football. But congratulations to Auckland, who were able to net a lot of money as well for that draw from that result. But that's it really for match day 3. I think it went quite positively. As I said, the main takeaways for me within that match day was that, you know, City still looked really impressive, potentially the best team in the tournament that I've seen so far, and the depth is really good. I think some teams like PSG haven't played particularly well. Luis Enrique has mentioned that the pitch has been an issue at times. He's also given a lot of credit to teams like Botafogo for defending really well in Matchday 2. So I don't think we can necessarily say that, PSG's dropped off a cliff. They still have Dembele expected to come back in the tournament. Do I think Dembele's going to start in the round of 16? Absolutely not. I think they'll actually take it quite easy with Dembele and probably look to have him start in the quarterfinal instead if they get there. And he probably comes off or comes on as a halftime sub in the round of 16 instead. I do think that this is probably the last stage in the tournament where I get to enjoy so many Brazilian holes. It's unfortunate, and I would like to back them if I felt like I was a bit more confident, but unfortunately I'm not, and that's kind of where we land. But very thankful towards a lot of the differential defenders who were able to carry my match day very much. No thanks to a lot of players that had really good games on paper and just didn't make use of them, like Girassi. So given all that I've actually said in terms of the bracket and the strategy piece, I just wanted to jump straight into the team selection. We don't necessarily have a lot of match day odds right now because unfortunately the games are going to happen after Saturday or Saturday evening and beyond, and we don't have enough odds right now in the markets for me to sort of make decisions. But I think that Opta piece is very helpful because at least it gives you a picture of how strong some teams are and how dominant they are expected to perform. If I can sort of share my own insights, I think that it makes a lot of sense to be investing into teams or players at this stage of the tournament who are above 5% owned. I've previously been championing a lot of going for sub 5% owned players, but I think right now at this stage of the tournament, there's a huge gap in terms of quality. So for example, I wouldn't be advising people to necessarily go for Inter Miami players who are sub 5% owned. You really want to still be going for players like Hakimi, as boring as that sounds. And then when I look across the board, it's probably only 1, 2, 3 players in across all the positions where I would actively look for sub 5% owned. When I think about keepers, for example, I think a lot of the stronger keepers make a lot more sense, because one of the issues, not necessarily just with the short-term aspect of the sub 5% and going for weaker teams, is I plan to personally play this new chip, this qualification booster chip, in match day 16 or match day 4, sorry, the round of 16. Reason being, I'll get the +2s instead from the qualifications, which I think that there's a much higher guarantee of, to be honest, when you look at the advanced percentages compared to my differentials popping off all together all at once. So I think there's safety in this stage of the tournament for me to actually go for as few sub 5% owned players as possible, or sub 5% owned players if they're really good and they have a really good chance of advancing. So the way that I've approached this, I've gone a little bit too heavy in terms of Dortmund for my liking. But the idea, I think, is that I'll probably maybe sell one of those players eventually for a defender within another team. I'm not super confident in triple Dortmund defense, but I have to say Monterrey have still, yes, so they scored 4 goals, or 5 goals rather than the tournament so far. 1 in a set piece versus Inter Milan, and then 4 versus Ura. But I still haven't been too impressed with their offense overall versus solid opposition. So I'd probably take my chances with going Svensson here, very attacking left back in this tournament. I'll still go Anton for the price aspect. He's actually someone that absolutely glues my draft together. I think the easy swap for Svensson or Kobel is simply to just move into another player in the same side of the bracket that will ultimately be the same price, right? Maybe Svensson can actually be even a player from a different side of the bracket, but the kind of strategy that I've gone for with the goalkeepers here is I've gone for Kobel and Sommer because they're in different sides of the bracket. So Sommer is someone who just has an amazing game in match day 4 here, and so is Kobel. They both actually don't have great games going forwards, but I'm sure they'll have pretty good chance of advancing. I've got a pretty high chance maybe of, let's say, moving one of these players to Ederson, especially if Al Hilal don't progress to the next stage. He's not too far away in terms of price. And then I've also thought about, shifting things around in terms of that Dortmund pick to maybe consider someone from maybe even like a Bayern, like a Neuer, just so that I'm not underinvested in a team like Bayern. But right now I've gone for Kobel and Sommer. They're on different sides of the brackets, and that's why I've actually gone for them. And I've gone for Anton and Svensson. Anton, who is sub 5. Hakimi, who I just think... Hakimi and Ait Nouri, I think, are players who will start in match day 4. Hakimi should start every game from the tournament for the rest of the tournament now, and I think that's quite strong for PSG. For Ait Nouri, I think I've been super impressed with him for Man City. We've seen him play in a back 5. We've seen him play in a back 4. I think he'll continue to actually start within the left back position for the rest of this tournament. I think he's been really impressing Pep. He got an assist as well versus Juventus, and honestly was super lively in the previous match as well versus Al Ain. So I really do like Ait Nouri, and I think he is the pick to go for to invest into City defense. And I might just double stack City defense because there's no reason with, ignoring the possibility to maybe quadruple up on such a strong team like City. So that's something I will be considering, but unfortunately, a lot of City players are quite expensive, and that can change the draft structure quite a fair bit. Right now, the draft that I have actually only has 0.4 in the bank. So the make weights that I'll probably need to look for would be to maybe consider reducing someone like Svensson, or maybe just rearranging my goalkeepers, that sort of thing, because some of the other goalkeepers are also quite cheap, or within that sort of 5.x range. As I said, I don't think you can find cheaper options necessarily in the goalkeeping positions that make a lot of sense from a sort of long-term strategy point of view. So this wildcard is going to hold you out for a bit. You don't really want to be using transfers in the future, even though you have a lot on your goalkeepers. So maybe I'll actually choose players who are actually expected to make it past the quarterfinals. What is nice though is that if let's say your goalkeeper makes it to the quarterfinal, you could and they both get knocked out. In theory, you would only really need maybe one goalkeeper, worst case scenario, in the semifinal. So it's not the worst thing in the world as long as they make it to the quarterfinal. You get at least to sort of, rid yourself of the worries of having to transfer your goalkeeper in the quarterfinal stage. And I think at least Kobel and Sommer at the bare minimum do that. Dumfries for me is also someone who is a little bit of a no-brainer. He's been rested a lot by Inter Milan within this tournament, but I think very much like Hakimi, he is essential to the team. And now that they actually need him, he will be playing games consistently. I also think the first game matchup here is just way too good for me to pass up on Dumfries. So I will be taking him up on the team. I've looked at some of the rotation in terms of some of the other defenders. Bastoni being over 5% makes it very hard to ignore Dumfries. And then I think the additional problem here is Acerbi could play, but there's been way too much rotation in the back line, and I just wouldn't trust it at the end of the day. In the midfield, shifting gears over towards that, I think Kvaratskhelia, Elise, and Doué are locks, to be honest, on most drafts. I would struggle to believe that a lot of people would actually ignore those three picks. I just think they're too solid, have 2 good minutes, are arguably too talismanic. Especially Doué with the absence of Dembele still expected for this part of the tournament. I think he makes sense. But I think you can also argue that Doué is a little bit interchangeable with someone like Vitinha. And the reason why I've actually not stacked PSG defense is because I think there's a lot of good clean sheet percentages on offer this week. And even though I am missing someone great like Nuno Mendes, he is quite expensive. And I think I'd still prefer going Dumfries over him. So the way I've chosen to attack quadruple PSG, as I think they are probably the first or second best team in the tournament still, I think Doué and Vitinha partnership would make a lot of sense because they're actually the best players, to go for at this stage. And I still think even when Dembele comes back, Doué's minutes aren't going to be significantly reduced. He could be an earlier sub as he has been in previous games, but I don't think that's a huge issue. One of the keys towards this wildcard draft is Joe Bellingham. I was going to say Jude Bellingham, but clearly this is the younger brother who's actually performed really well so far. He didn't start in Matchday 1, but since then he's actually done really, really well. He only played, I think, 58 minutes in Matchday 3, and part of that, I think, is because Dortmund were in a very, very safe position in the group, and we've actually seen a lot of rotation for this Dortmund team, so I think that does concern me a little bit, right? Julian Brandt hasn't started all the games. His minutes, even when he's been starting, has been poor. I think the same case can be applied to Joe, but I think being a sub 5% owned player, having really good chances, in my opinion, of starting here in Matchday 4, and at least, with the possibility of breaking 60 minutes like he did, for example, versus Mamelodi Sundowns, where he played 84 minutes, I think Job is an absolute steal of a pick, and I think he just makes too much sense considering how good Dortmund's initial game is. And one of the issues, I suppose, in the future is to replace Joe Bellingham if he gets knocked out of the tournament, which will probably happen in the quarterfinal stage. I'll probably have to use 2 free transfers on this, but I think at this moment, he just fits in way too nicely in terms of balancing the entire draft. And I really do like him as a pick. In the forward position, to round out the draft, I've actually decided to go with 3 players here: Haaland, Lautaro Martinez, and Delap. Now, I've mentioned that I want to go with the Dortmund quadruple up. A lot of people might be shocked that there's no Guirassy here, but I think Lautaro Martinez also makes a lot of sense as a pick. I think he actually has a really good game as well. One of the things when I was thinking about drafting this team was that I found it very, very hard to actually pick the right Dortmund players, and also, when I flip this on its head, I found it really hard to also pick Inter Milan players too. So with that sort of difficulty in mind, I felt like it made a lot of sense to actually go Lautaro Martinez since I had money in the bank left, because he's such a key player for that team. He's someone who is most likely going to be able to take penalties, given that Çalhanoğlu is still diagnosed with a strain. That means that he's probably not going to be seen for the rest of this tournament potentially. So I do really like Lautaro as a pick. He's played a lot of games so far. He's had a lot of great chances, and he's just a talisman for this team. There are cheaper players in this Inter Milan team, and I think actually, Esposito from, or in this case, Franco Esposito here is probably the pick that will, or in this case, Francesco Pio Esposito is most likely going to continue starting alongside Lautaro Martinez, and he is very, very cheap. But I still think I would actually ultimately be happy with going with Lautaro Martinez. You do still want the talisman in these types of games. You don't want to deal with early substitutions. You want a player who most likely is going to be impactful going forwards. As much as Esposito is going to be sort of a star-studded talent for Inter Milan going forwards. As far as Delap is someone who, very much like Joe Bellingham, rounds out the draft really well with Jackson's suspension and Chelsea actually having a pretty average game here. I would still take him because his chances of starting, in my opinion, for both Matchday 4 and if they advance in the quarterfinals would be quite high. And to me, that's sort of what I just really want from Delap. So he also has the chance to potentially drop below 5% because a lot of people did transfer him specifically for Matchday 3 and might still transfer him out for Matchday 4. But I would actually like to keep him in my draft because I was really struggling to sort of pick players within this draft here that would actually fit the team. I've gone for Haaland over Kane over Guirassy as well because I've kind of changed my minds in terms of who are the strongest teams in the tournament. I think City are just a step above. If Bayern were to advance anyways, they're most likely to face off versus PSG, which is just a much tougher game than, let's say, Haaland would have versus Inter Milan. That's just how I see it. So I think I'd like to take Haaland here. I think also when you look at investing into City, he's one of the few players that makes a lot of sense in terms of minutes, that should have guaranteed minutes going forwards now, even though he's actually been very much bubble wrapped in the group stages. He just makes too much sense. So this is the draft that I'm going with. I think a couple things are subject to change in terms of maybe I am over invested into Dortmund. Maybe there's more roots towards City players within this team. Ederson could be one of those players as an entry point. And maybe a little bit too little Chelsea, right? I could go for a Sanchez. I could go for a Colwill. Players that I think should be nailed for Chelsea going forwards. And it would still be quite cheap in terms of replacing some of my Dortmund players. So those are my thoughts. But I think I've invested very heavily into teams just to sort of support this qualification booster chip. That's why I haven't gone too deep into Chelsea. So mixed sort of priorities here, but best of luck with your team selection. I hope that just using some of the cheat sheets previously and looking at some of those teams, you kind of have a good understanding of some of the players that I think make a lot of sense. I'd be very happy to share a potential cheat sheet if I have some time this week, and this week being Friday, but we'll see if we can get to that. Otherwise, I hope to see you guys in the live stream on Saturday. Take care. Enjoy the rest of the tournament. I'll see you guys soon.